think if we just take this parable on its face and we read it at a surface level, there's not a lot of good news in this, is there? There really is not much good news in this parable. This parable, if we read it on a surface level, the good girls and good guys win, the bad girls and bad boys lose. Perfect, Gene, thank you. I forget to move ahead, thank you. Selfish people win, right? Selfish people who don't share are the ones that get into the banquet. And the ones who are lacking and humble, and maybe they've made a mistake, they don't get into the kingdom of heaven. If we read this at a surface level, it's if you do all the right things, when God comes unexpected, when you least expect God to come, if you've been doing the right thing, then you'll get into the kingdom of heaven. But if you haven't, woe be unto you. You'll be knocking on the door, and Jesus is going to say, I don't even know you. This is pretty scary. Let me have one more. This is in parables in November. November is Apocalypse month. And it's about the end of times. And this is a scary parable. And in tens of thousands of churches, this is going to be preached today, that this is the meaning of this parable, if we read this at a surface level. But if Jesus said, go out and preach the good news, and this is a story from Jesus, and we don't find some good news in here, then I think we're coming at this the wrong way. Jesus never speaks in surface ways, though, does he? He always goes deeper. And there's a whole ton of messages in this parable if we're ready to hear them. Let me have one more, Jane. So once again, the kingdom of heaven is a banquet. It's a sumptuous banquet. And now you would expect in an apocalyptic sermon, God to be coming as what? A judge, right? There's a courtroom scene. Have you been a good girl? You get into the banquet. If you're not, you don't get into the banquet. But God doesn't come as a judge, does he? God comes as a bridegroom. Okay, this is different. God is a bridegroom seeking a lover. God comes also at night. So if we're looking at night and we're looking at darkness, what are periods in your life that have been dark? And what does darkness represent when we typically look in the New Testament and in the Hebrew Bible? Darkness is times and places of uncertainty. Darkness is a time of fear. Darkness is a time when we need light. Darkness is a place where we typically learn more in our periods of darkness than we do in our periods of light. And when does God decide to show up in this parable? Not just in the darkness, but at midnight, right? After the 11th hour? When we think about light in the Bible, we think about enlightenment. We think about being awake. We think about, light, we think we can see light, but actually light is the thing by which we see other things and other people. And so God comes not as a judge, but God comes in the middle of the night when we're at our darkest. I bet if I ask for a show of hands, which I won't, but I bet many of us have learned more from our mistakes than from our successes, right? We've learned more from times of darkness than we have in times when we were walking in the light. And this is when God decides to show up in the parable. This whole thing about doing your homework is what we're doing here today. You have to enter your own spiritual journey on your own and learn from your darkness, or you're not going to be ready when the King comes. It's actually a little bit of practical advice. If you haven't done your homework, if you haven't sought wisdom, if you haven't asked for enlightenment on your own, of course we bring others with us, but if you haven't done this journey on your own, by yourself, you're not going to perceive, you're not going to know who God is when God shows up. It's really just some practical advice. Let me have one more. So we have the 5 wise or prudent bridesmaids, and we have these other 5. If we think about oil as something incredibly valuable, which is these girls are enlightened. Why? They're enlightened because they've embarked on a spiritual journey and they now possess the light within themselves. So when the bridegroom comes, they're ready. They're ready to hear his voice. So are these selfish girls? Well, if you think about it, no. Because no one can enlighten you. You have to take that journey on your own by yourself. And so the girls say, no, we can't share this with you. It's not something I can give you. You have to now go out into the dark and find your own light. You have to find your own oil. We have one more. Finding your own light as the prerequisite for the entrance into the kingdom of heaven. So Marta and I were talking about this, and this is where I think it gets better. The parable gets better. Right now, you'd think we would have a list of moral requirements for also what you had to do to get into the banquet, right? You had to have been a good girl. You had to have done this. You had to have done this. You had to avoid doing this. But there are no moral requirements. There's no judgments. There's no, if you've done this much, you get in. If you've done this much, you don't. Marta and I were talking about it as the only entrance and the only requirement for entrance is that you've sought wisdom, that you've sought knowledge, that you've sought enlightenment, that you have not compartmentalized, stuffed your pain or your darkness, but you've been willing to embark on a spiritual journey and learn from it. Marta's mother called her Grace growing up, and it actually is kind of cruel. But Marta still calls herself Grace. This past week, Marta was standing on the ladder of the little blow-up pool that she has in the backyard, this above-ground pool. And her feet slipped, and she slid down, and she has bruises all up and down the outside of her thighs. She took a mason jar. I'm not making fun because she told me I could tell the story. She took one of those ball jars with hot chicken soup in it, and you know, I guess I learned this from Marta. When you twist the top, it'll go pop, and the little lid pops down, and then she put it in the freezer. Well, it's shattered. So she takes it out. She's determined to get the chicken soup out of the ball jar. And I said, Marta, don't just let it melt. Just let it go. No, I have to get it out. She starts doing this and slice. I have a picture. I was going to show it, but I just didn't have time to do it. I took a selfie with me holding Marta's hand, and she's got this bandage about this big around her finger, and she just has a look on her face like, this is so neat. Marta said, when it comes time for Jesus to turn up, I'm going to have a lamp, I think. I'm going to have a lamp, and I'm going to have oil in my lamp. But you know what? I'm going to say, Jesus, oh my gosh, there you are. And I'm going to run, and my big klutzy feet are going to stumble, and I'm going to break my lamp and spill the oil all over everywhere. Do you think Jesus is going to keep me out of the banquet? No. Because this is the only requirement, is this wisdom, is this seeking of wisdom. We go into a little different territory now as I start to sort of wrap this up. Jesus says something at the end that might sound very cruel. And I like how Richard Rohr and Henry Nouwen explore this. He says to these bridesmaids, I never knew you, or I don't know you. And if you look at the way in the Hebrew language, there's different meanings of the word to know. One is head knowledge. Jesus saying, I don't know you. The other is an intimate knowledge, a body knowledge. When the angel Gabriel goes to Mary and says, you will conceive and bear a son, she says, how can this be? I have never known a man. I'm not saying God comes as a bridegroom, as a lover, with that type of intimate knowledge. But what I am saying is, this is a body knowledge that we get. As we seek wisdom, this is not just a knowledge that we think of in our heads as we connecting our heads with our hearts, with our body. This becomes embodied knowledge. I was driving through southern Utah on my way back yesterday, and I rode through, there's a town called Price, Utah, and it goes through a pass over Soldiers Point and then down into Provo. Just a beautiful mountain pass. And I was just having this quiet, private conversation with God, and all of a sudden I was almost hypnotized. And for an hour and a half I was driving, and I felt a real embodied connection with God that I don't feel very often. And it's weird, it was right in preparation for this sermon where I'm talking about embodied knowledge. And for me to try to describe it to you, there's no words to describe it. In our book study, The Shack, we've had several of us talk about experiences like this where we have seen and felt the presence of God in our bodies and what it feels like. And it's a feeling like being in love. You can't describe to someone what it's like to be in love. You have to experience it for yourself. And what Jesus is saying is not mean, but you haven't done your homework yet. Go back out into the darkness and do your homework. And when you finish doing your spiritual homework and you've engaged in your spiritual journey and you're able to feel me not only in mind but in body, then this is where you belong. Let me have one more. I've had the feeling this week, and this is the sort of message that I was receiving as I was driving over the mountain. And we've all been, I say we've all been stressed about the election, but it's been very consuming, hasn't it? I mean, you turn on the TV or the radio, and I got this feeling that we're fighting over crumbs. Yes, they're important crumbs. We want people to have food and health care and justice, and we want people to be able to keep what they work for, and these are important things. But ultimately, we're all spiritual beings having an embodied experience. And when we tap into this knowledge of God through wisdom that becomes not just head knowledge but heart knowledge, we're able to look out and see everyone else around us as a spiritual being engaged in their own spiritual journeys. And it is at this point that we no longer need to power over people. We don't need to control people. It's when we cannot judge people. It's when this head knowledge becomes soul, body wisdom. And that's what we see.